There are two statements common in the press today. First, that Yemen imports 90% of its food, which should, of course, be corrected to 90% of its grain consumption. And second, and so we've heard already many references to it, that Yemen faces a man-made famine. In the 1970s, and despite damage during the 1962-68 war, North Yemen was 85% self-sufficient, oops, I'm going the wrong way, in grain. That grain was largely sorghum, barley, and millet, and it is sorghum growing in the fields of this image. This figure in the 1973 celebration in Eb, a town of in Lower Yemen that receives the most rainfall, in the celebration in Eb of the Republican Revolution, which of course was in 1962, reminds us that agricultural production is one of the most important fundamental constituents of the national economy and calls for redoubling production. An appeal to that era occurred in the demonstrations from 2011. Youth held aloft the image of assassinated President Ibrahim al-Hamdi. Under his photo, it's written, "We are not of your generation, but we love you." Al-Hamdi is most commonly remembered today for his promotion of a rural cooperative movement. But over the 40 years since al-Hamdi's death, the force of the oil dollar, backed by the neoliberal policies of the Western development complex, devalued Yemeni rural human and animal labor. Embodied in the cheap wheat from the United States that flooded Yemen from the 1970s, the complex facilitated the mass exit of Yemeni male rural labor to build the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia until no longer needed and or docile. Oversaw the devaluation of the historical investment in terracing, agricultural knowledge, and water husbandry that had supported rural life. Cheapened rare subsoil water by quick access to what was always known to be a limited resource requiring husbandry. Linked local political life to outside markets as never before, erasing the women's question and family planning from state policy. Rendered state officials traders in food imports, and more generally transformed Yemeni elite forms of consumption and imagination into those which alone it could provide. So when Yemen, however inchoately, began to protest its subjection, the armies and air forces of the oil dollar, with bombers fed oil even aerially, came to destroy physically those products of Yemeni labor that survived the prior economic devastation. What do we know of the targeting of rural life and artisanal fishing in Yemen? Why am I putting up this map? Just to remind you something of the geography, i.e. Yemen receives rain in this rather dry part of the world because it has a large mountain chain that goes up the middle. But why rural Yemen? Simply put, it is still the bulk of the country. Some 65% of Yemen's population still lives in dispersed villages, and over half of the population relies in part or in whole on agriculture and animal husbandry. Sites of food production, villages are inevitably less visible in media than the urban centers, and they are regions from which, as an ILO Central Statistical Office survey 7 months into the war tells us, 2/3 of the internally displaced come, leading to a loss of almost 50% of the workers in agriculture. And why artisanal fishing of the Red Sea? Where's the, yeah? I'm going to talk a little bit about this part. Prior to the war, after oil, because Yemen is an oil producer, although on a much smaller scale than its neighbors. Fish was Yemen's second and largest export. And Tehama, this area here, the coastal plain, and Tehama, the Red Sea plain, has long been a zone of great inequality and deepening food insecurity, in spite of its eminent historical position in both agricultural and fish production. What data sources do we have? When the Western embassies in Sana'a closed in the run-up to the war, the international agencies, including the Food and Agriculture Organization, halted their support to Yemeni ministries in Sana'a. In what, and I asked him a year ago or so, the head of the Cairo FAO office brushed off as a political decision. Thus, the specialized agencies, who were so powerful before the war in Yemen's governance, have published little or nothing on the damage wrought. Evidently, this was promised to be a short war, and so such high-quality damage assessment as the agencies have released belongs all to 2015. Here's damage around the city of Saada in the north, to which we'll return, and here another on Sana'a. Given the only two clear skies of Yemen for much of the year, high-tech aerial photographic damage assessment at night or day is entirely feasible, not just for the military, but for the big organizations. Thus, in trying to fill the general information gap, an internationally more disturbing public erasure of information, we, and that includes Cynthia, who does all the maps you'll see, we have drawn on three primary data sets. First, the data compiled by the extension officers of the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation, which I'll refer to as the MAI, covering the period March 2015 to August 2016. Second, the set of data from the Yemen Data Project, or the YDP, now covering strikes from March 2015 to March 2018. And that's compiled essentially by local journalists from social media and from local press reports. And lastly, a comprehensive report from the Ministry of Fish Wealth, issued in January 2018. Essentially, the lists from the sources in Yemen corroborate each other, but with some important differences given their distinct sources. Our work is thus very artisanal, drawn from Yemeni sources, but unlike the meticulous documentation of particular strikes required to establish a war crime in the rights register of individual cases, we try to deduce wider patterns. What was the periodicity of the strikes? This is from the YDP, okay, because it gives you the whole run. There were strikes on civilian targets from the outset, but whereas military targets were more frequent than civilian through September 2015, for 5 of the 6 months from October 2015 to March 2016, civilian targets outstripped military. Is it clear enough? The blue is civilian. The dotted is unknown because the YDP it knows where there was a strike, but it doesn't know what was being struck. And the sort of brownier one is our military strikes. And in 10 of the 18 months between March 2015 and August 2016, the number of civilian targets recorded by the YDP was over 200. The rest of the run is as you have it. As I noted, YDP has many targets unidentified save by place, many of which are also doubtless civilian in nature. What did the coalition, or what is the coalition targeting? Let's start with the MAI data. As I said, this was compiled by the MAI extension workers through early August 2016. By that time, that is August 2016, As an MAI official noted when asked, he said, and I put the question through a friend, why did you stop collecting data? He said, all our facilities have been bombed. As in this slide, this is what the extension officers from different parts and also from the south, even though they weren't allowed to officially, they got the data out to the ministry in Sana'a because they valued it being logged. As in this slide, agricultural land was the target most frequently hit, but other components of rural life were also targeted. One should remember that according, for example, to the Food and Agriculture Organization statistics, agriculture covers less than 3% of Yemen's land, forests 1%, and pastures just under 42%. In short, to target agriculture requires a certain aim. It's not like some places we can think of where you kind of have to aim it. If we had time, I would have brought lovely pictures to demonstrate this. Placing the total targets on, and of course this is not to scale, but at least it gives you a sense of the scatter. Placing the total targets on a map of Yemen produces this image. It is worth returning to the red dots. The targeting of agricultural offices expresses two things. First, the destruction of rural services, but second, it is part of a much wider attack on government and technical facilities. I'm not showing you maps of that kind of data here, but it is. As for spatial distribution, as Saudi General Asiri said 6 months into the war, all of the Sada governorate, and that's the far north of Yemen, was for the coalition a military zone, and hence from the outset particularly heavily targeted. And so here you can see, broken down by small districts in Sada, what the MAI extension workers reported were hit. Turning to the YDP data, we see, and that's Sada Governorate, and this is the circle for Sada Governorate, once again stands out, although closely followed by Sana'a, because Sana'a has two circles. It has a circle for the city, am I in the right place? I can hardly see, and a circle for the wider governorate. It is represented by separate pie circles for the city and the wider region that bears its name. The proportion of civilian to military targets, however, is highest in Sada and in Hadeda Governorate. Okay? The blue is the civilian in relation to unknown and military. In the latter, there we have the coastal plain, okay, and this is intensity of striking by districts from the YDP data covering the 3 years of the war. In the latter, in Tehama, aside from the north and south, where respectively Saudi, up the north there in Harad, Saudi, and in the south, Emirati-paid forces, because we have Sudanese fighting up north. It's now Saudis are beginning to come in. And we have a combination of allies of the Emiratis, as well as Emiratis, down south. Sorry. Aside from the north and the south, where respectively the Saudi and Emirati-paid forces seek to move in a pincer to seize the port city of Hadeda, the central zones of the coastal plain of Tehama have generally been less heavily bombed than the lands of Sada. This is Sada, of course, and this is administratively, Tehama belongs to 3 different governorates, to Ta'az, to Hadeda, and to Hadja up north. But that doesn't matter. It's actually physically a single zone. We are presently working on comparing the strategy, and this is work in progress. All the maps are work in progress too. We are presently working on comparing the strategy employed against Sada with that employed against Tehama. In the first, we have chosen 2 districts, Raza and Haydan, for closer analysis. Here, the targeting of objects indispensable to the survival of rural residents appears systematic. This is a first mapping exercise for the district of Haydan that covers only what was hit in the first 2 years of the war, according to the YDP, and correlates data from the MAI with data from the YDP for those first 2 years. In fact, the MAI is not fully the full second 2 years, but with the YDP data for the first 2 years of the war. That's because the YDP data has come out sequentially as they follow developments. So we did this mapping as a first attempt a while back. Of course, much more has been hit during year 3. In Sada Governorate, there's a kind of scorched earth policy. It was brought home to me when I saw that the last target logged by the YDP for 2017 was a cholera unit in Sada city. In the arid plain of Tehama, by contrast, agriculture is focused. Here we're dealing with a mountain, and there's bits and pieces of agriculture and rural life all up and down the mountains. But in the arid plain of Tehama, by contrast, agriculture is focused on the great spate flood wadi systems. A fine report by the Water and Environment Center of Sana University, with support from Meta and the Dutch government, based on surveys in 2017 in wadis. Let me go and look at it. In wadis, in wadis, can I see? In wadis, Siham and Zabid. Siham is here, okay? And Zabid is a very big system, because what matters is how much is in the mountains. So the really big ones are quite more, drains a huge area, and the other, so they did good surveying in Wadi Siham and in Wadi Zabid. Just tell you what we learn very briefly from that. The report of WEC and Meta reveals that hunger grew among farmers. 43% of people go hungry every night, 89% reported less food, 72% reported of food of lower quality. 61% of the farming population, and these are not the poorest areas in Tehama by any manner of means, have no education for their children. 50% had exhausted all savings and stocks of food. Land under cultivation was halved. Crop yields were down by various proportions between 20 and 60%. Vegetable and fruit production had ceased, and livestock was decimated. The other major component of food production in Tehama has likewise been heavily damaged. This map is a first and as yet not very successful attempt to represent what a detailed report by the Ministry of Fish Wealth that I mentioned as having come out in January 2018 reveals. Virtually every fish offloading port was targeted or has been targeted. 220 boats have been destroyed. And by the end of 2017, 146 named fishermen with where they live, where they were killed, have been killed. For me, it's terribly reminiscent of Gaza. Limits on how far from shore boats may go. In the occupied areas of southern Tehama, we have newspaper that is Mocha and Hoja, down in the south where the Emiratis are, we have press reports, and from their own press, from Gulf press actually, of restrictions on the days when fishers may go out. And as you can see from these statistics and this attempt at giving an image to this, seizure and killing of fishers. In closing, in a political piece I published in September 2015, because along with other Yemen scholars, we've been screaming since April 2015 about these things, I wrote that I felt that the Yemen war threatened an erasure of legal reference. This is certainly true for the United Kingdom, which even more shamefully than the United States is, after all, the former colonial power. For Saudi Arabia, for the UAE and Yemen represented in the legitimate government of Hadi, since all of them, even if our colleagues are saying it's not a terribly powerful document, since all of them, Saudi Arabia, UAE, UK, and Yemen, are, after all, signatories to the 1977 protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions. And as Article 54 states, starvation as a method of warfare is prohibited, and it's prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, drinking water installations, and supplies and irrigation works, for the specific purpose of denying them for their sustenance value to the civilian population or to the adverse party, whatever the motive, whether in order to starve out civilians, to cause them to move away, or for any other motive. Thank you.